Hello, good morning, and welcome everyone. Thank you all for joining us at the Black Consciousness Festival. Today we are having a really interesting discussion with Dr. Sylviane Diouf. Welcome, Dr. Diouf, to the Black Consciousness Festival. Today we are going to be discussing or sharing information about how it all began, basically a conversation about the events that preceded the colonial project, the complex and diverse historical context for the transatlantic slave trade and reparations being paid to descendants of Africans enslaved in the Americas. Good morning, Dr. Diouf. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
Great. And you are coming to us from New York City, correct?
Yes.
Lovely. And so let's get right into the conversation. Or actually, let me tell our guests a little bit about you. Dr. Sylviane Diouf is an award-winning social historian of the African Diaspora. She is a visiting scholar at Brown University's Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. She's curated 12 exhibitions and authored and edited 13 books. As social historian, Dr. Diouf focuses on uncovering essential stories and topics that were overlooked or negated, which offer new insights into the African diaspora. She has a special interest in the experience of the Africans deported through the international slave trades to the Atlantic and Indian Ocean worlds, including the particular experience of African Muslims. Dr. Diouf is the author of the acclaimed books Servants of Allah, African Muslims Enslaved in the Americas, and she has won several prizes for Dreams of Africa in Alabama, the Slave Ship Clotilda, and the story of the last Africans brought to America, and is the author more recently of Slavery's Exiles, the story of the American Maroons. So, Dr. Diouf, let's dive right into our conversation. Tell us a little bit about your own personal history. It's very interesting. Tell us about your own story and how that led and motivated you to do the work you have dedicated your life
to. Thank you for that question. I was born in France, near Paris, about 10 minutes from Paris, in a suburb of about 50,000 people. My father was a physicist. He was from Senegal. My mother was a principal and French. And when I say was, I mean, she's still with us. But of course, she's no longer a school principal.
Right.
So we lived there, you know, with my sister and my brother. And even though it may look very strange, but it took me decades, really decades, to realize that we were the only Black people in the city.
Wow.
I never felt different from anybody, neither did my siblings. We were never made to feel different. So it really, again, you know, we, all of us, you know, we realized we were the only Blacks, you know, in school or in the city when we were maybe, I don't know, for me it must have been, you know, in my 30s. Things have changed. If I were growing up there today, I would probably know very early that I was not like everybody else. And then there's something happened. And something happened on TV. I saw dogs attacking people, and it was in the United States. They were Black people, but to me that didn't mean anything because I had no, you know, as I mentioned, I had no racial consciousness. So the fact that they were Black, you know, that had nothing. That did nothing to me. Right. I just was totally appalled by the fact that people could have dogs attack other people. And to me, I mean, I was young. I thought it was the worst thing that people could do to other people. So that really stayed with me. And over the years, I tried to understand what it was. Of course, it was, the civil rights movement. And I discovered slavery. I mean, for me, it was really a discovery because I had never heard of that. I had never heard of racism.
Right.
I had not lived racism. Actually, when I talked, to my parents about the fact that, my father was the first Black person in our town, they said, again, they never experienced any looks or remarks or anything. So all of that was completely foreign to me. And, when I discovered slavery and racism, I was in shock. And I, started to look further into it, etc., over the years. And I ended up doing my dissertation on resistance to slavery. And, that was really, so that was many, many years, many decades ago. And that's what I've been doing ever since. What I really realized, when I started, but also more and more as I work, on that in that field, is that there are a million things that still need to be discovered and written about. We have really just scratched the surface.
Yeah. That's absolutely similar to the things that we hear from other people that we've been having conversations with. And so, it's interesting that there's this common thread. You've said in previous interviews that you're a social historian. Yeah. Tell us what that means.
Well, I think that, first of all, the reason why I write, it's not because I know those extraordinary things that I want to share with the world. I write about something because I don't know anything about that topic. And so the first thing I do is to look for books on that. And if I don't find any, then I said, okay, so I will write a book. And so I start the research. And the questions that I have are very, very simple, very, it's really about the people. What was their life like? What was their experience? I'm really not interested in kind of the history from the top of or political history or economic history. I'm really interested in in the individuals, in the small, in the people, and really interested, again, in their daily lives, in their experiences. So, for example, I had read many books on Maroons, in Cuba, in Brazil, in Suriname, in Jamaica, of course. And I had questions about what about the United States? And I couldn't find anything, except for Maroons in Florida, but it's a very particular case. So I started to look into that. And I found out that actually probably most Maroons in the United States were living not in faraway places, like in Jamaica, in the mountains, or in Brazil. They were living really at the border of plantations, farms, and cities. And I called them borderland Maroons. And I was surprised by that because I was wondering, okay, so if you live so close to inhabited areas, you have good reasons to do that, but it's very dangerous. So how do you build a life there? And what I saw is that, people wanted to keep in close contact with their loved ones who were still enslaved. You know, there were strategies why people would, part of the family would become Maroons and the other part would stay on plantations or but then, you know, when you look at how do you live there, you know, since you cannot cultivate, you cannot raise animals,
Yeah.
where do you get your food? What kind of food is it?
Yeah.
What kind of clothes do you wear? What kind of habitat do you have? And that is where I discovered something that totally astonished me. Many of those borderland Maroons were actually living underground.
Oh, wow.
In what they call their house dens or caves. So they dug houses like 6 feet under, and they closed them, you know, with a trap door, very well camouflaged, so that it wouldn't be seen from above. And they would stay there sometimes for years. I mean, you know, I have one example which really struck me was this couple in Virginia who live in a cave with their 15 children for over 15 years.
15 children, wow.
It was incredible. And some of those caves were well furnished, and people would build pipes that would take the smoke out far away so that they wouldn't be that it wouldn't be found. And you know, people arranged a whole life underground. But it was also very hard, especially for children, because some of those children never got out of the caves.
Wow.
So it shows you, you know, first of all, the ingenuity of people who are able to create a completely new life for themselves, but also the horror of being enslaved, because that was, living that way was much better than being enslaved.
Yeah.
I also found that, you know, I also looked at the lives of the people who were further away, whom I call the hinterland Maroons.
Right.
And so sometimes, you know, there were groups of 20 to 80 people. And you know, they had gardens, they had crops, they raised some animals.
Yeah.
But again, they did not, even though they were further away, they were not very far, because they still also wanted to keep in touch, you know, with the people in the cities and on the farms and plantations. And they also wanted to have access to all the stuff that they could not produce. And they helped themselves, just like the borderland Maroons did, in the storehouses of the slaveholders. They robbed, you know, the stores, you know, that kind of things. So you have really a kind of an unknown world living very close to, you know, to the cities, the farm and the plantation, and all of them able to create a completely new life. I found that totally fascinating. Now, I also, you know, there were 2 books that were published on the slave ship Wanderer, a ship that arrived in Georgia with about 400 people on board in 1858. And there were 2, as I mentioned, there are 2 books written about that story. And it was all, all about the white men who organized, you know, this expedition, and the rivalries, and you know, the politics of the time, and the economics, this, that, and the other. And there are like a few pages on the people who were
on the ship.
So, you know, when I decided to write a book on the last known slave ship to the United States, the Clotilda, which arrived in Alabama in July of 1860, my view as a social historian, again, was completely different. I didn't care. I wasn't going to write about the white men, blah, blah, blah. I was interested really in the people who were on the ship, reconstructing their lives in Benin and Nigeria before, and then during the Middle Passage and during slavery, and after they became free 5 years later, and they founded a town that still exists, Africa Town,
Oh,
where
wow.
some of their descendants.
Descendants.
And by the way, the ship itself, the Clotilda, was discovered, sunk in 2019.
Recently, yes, yeah. I heard about that.
Yeah. So again, I was really interested in the lives of the people throughout, until the last one died. In Africa Town, the last one died in 1935. So I also look at the lives of their children,
Right.
how culture was passed on, etc. So this is really, so that's what social history is, really.
Yeah.
Again, history from the bottom,
Yes.
looking at the way that people lived, and that really gives us, a good idea, because usually, I think that people mostly think that when they think about the people who were enslaved, they think about numbers, about a mass of people, and whose stories cannot really be known. And actually, it can be known.
Yes.
It's not easy because there are few. The people themselves left few written traces. So you have to, when you go to the archives, or you have to really read the sources against the grain, explore sources that have not been explored, reinterpret a lot of the things that have been written about or said. And it's really a detective work, if you will. But it really put, really the human face on people, and I think that's really today that's indispensable.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, it's really giving voice to the voiceless, right? And revealing these essential stories that, as people of African descent, we are yet to hear. You're absolutely right that there are very few of these written accounts. And I could kind of identify with you about the detective work, because I was recently working on a project to pull together stories about this period and slavery, and I found myself doing that similar kind of work, reading multiple sources and trying to read in between the sources and read what's not actually there. So I understand that process fully. European colonization, the trafficking and enslavement of Africans in the Americas, it emerged from colonial projects that's of the Iberian Peninsula, which is specifically Spain and Portugal. But Spain and Portugal were once part of a kingdom called Al-Andalus for over 700 years, a space where Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived together, which is known as the convivencia. How did notions of faith and the purity of blood surface in their attempt the Christians' attempt to take over the Iberian Peninsula, which is also known as the Reconquista, after hundreds of years of all these diverse peoples living together? And how did that contribute to the creation and the justification of the transatlantic trafficking of Africans for centuries?
Yeah, that's really key. And really, the colonization of the Americas is the anti-convivencia. As the supremacy of one people and one religion.
Yeah.
And what happened, for example, in Spain at the time was the Jews were expelled. There were forced conversions. The Muslims who had converted to and became Christian were finally expelled as well. There was really with the Inquisition, you know, it was really the triumph of terrorist Catholicism, with people horribly tortured and burned to death. I mean, and that was, by the way, that was transported to the Americas. You know, the Inquisition had seats in Colombia, in Peru, and Mexico. So what was also created at the time was something that was unique, that had never existed before in the world. And that was racial slavery. So the linkage of slavery with what we refer today as race. So before, you know, there had never been a link between origin and
slave.
So Europeans, enslaved Europeans, actually, you know, in the 1460s, enslaved West Africans were working in Portugal alongside, you know, Berbers and Arabs and Turks and Greeks and Slavs, etc. And in the Islamic world, slavery had never been based on race either. You know, they enslaved Europeans, they enslaved Africans, they enslaved other people. That was true in the Ottoman Empire, that was true in India as well. And Africans, just like everybody else who had been enslaved, were also, it was also possible for them to rise through the ranks and gain high positions. Now, what was done for the Americas, so was this creation, this innovation of only Africans could be enslaved. And so there needed a justification, you know, for the conquest and for this enslavement. So the idea was that the only truly humans were white people, and indigenous people in the Americas were inferior, and Africans were subhumans, savages, cannibals, pagans, and so they were the only ones who were fit to be enslaved, and only fit to do the most manual, arduous work. So that was the creation of racism, and you know, other colonial powers like France and Great Britain and the Netherlands jumped on that, and they accepted that new concept as well. So this is, you know, not only was there this incredibly destructive notion, but the transatlantic slave trade was also, I mean, the magnitude of the transatlantic slave trade was unparalleled. It lasted about 350 years, and 12.5 million Africans were deported in 350 years.
Wow.
Now you can compare that to what happened for the rest of, you know, if you take all the other slave trades out of Africa and combine them, you know, through the Sahara, the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean, etc. You have about the same number of people who were deported, maybe a little less, but that lasted 1,500 years.
Wow.
So just to, you know, build up the point, 350 years, 12.5 million people through the Atlantic, 1,500 years, about the same number through all other slave trades combined. So it was the largest slave trade in history. And if we look at what happened, so, you know, in the Americas, again, in terms of numbers, between 1500 and 1820, 11.5 million people entered the Americas.
Right.
8.9 million of them were Africans.
Wow.
That was 80%. 80% of people until 1820 who got, who landed in the Americas were Africans.
Wow.
So their arrival was massive and in a very short period of time. And, their contribution also was massive. And we all know, about, the fact that they mined and they cultivated, the riches of the continent, and built the cities and towns, and, but they also introduced new ways of cultivating crops, new ways of cattle ranching and blacksmithing and many other things. They also created English, French, Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, Creoles.
Yes.
And
new languages,
and new languages, new cuisine, new religions, new rituals, they fought for their freedom. They fought for the independence of the country that had enslaved them. I mean, their contributions in situations that were absolutely horrendous. Again, their creativity and their resilience were extraordinary. And they really achieved a lot. And again, that is not probably known enough, at least
enough. You're right.
Public.
You're absolutely right. It's interesting. As you were talking about the contribution of the Africans who were brought forcibly to the Americas, it's reminded me of the first time I went to New Orleans a couple of years ago. I visited the Whitney Plantation. I don't know if you've been there. And going on the tour on that Whitney Plantation, it was the first time that I'd ever heard, and when I heard it, it made sense, but it's the first time I'd ever interacted with the idea that the Africans that were brought to the Americas to be enslaved, they didn't come tabula rasa. They didn't come as people who had to be trained and taught things, but actually it's the opposite, that they were selected and chosen to be taken from civilizations that already had advanced specializations and knowledge. And so, for example, the tour guide was saying that in the construction of many great houses on the plantation, in many cases, it was the Africans that were brought that guided the Europeans as to in what direction to build a house so that air flows through it. Those kinds of technologies that they understood coming from tropical climates that Europeans coming from temperate climates might not have understood in the early days of settling the Americas. And that blew my mind because it's something that I had never heard in my educational process, at least. Having said that, tell us about how Europe has or has not confronted its colonial past and slavery.
Yeah, I think, it's still very, I think, by and large, people in Europe have no concept of what colonization was. Wow. It's and decolonization as well, even though it's kind of close to us because for example, the French colonies became independent in the 1960s, and the Portuguese colonies in Africa, for example, in the 1970s. But again, it was something that happened far away, and that probably was seen mostly in a kind of a positive way, because you were bringing people who had no cultures, no languages, only dialects, to civilization and modernity. It was, you went there to kind of help them.
Yes.
These, the language that was used at the time was, for example, was pacification.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea that what the colonizer found, it was chaos, it was wars, etc. And they came to bring peace, right? So I think that all of that we can see actually. I think the hypocrisy and the cynicism of all of this with World War II mainly, but also starting in World War One. When I look at a country like France, for example, when during those two wars where they were going to be subjugated by the Germans and fall into how could I say that, kind of being colonized, if you will, by Germany. They, of course, they and Great Britain and others called on the colonial subjects, to come and fight the wars with them, to defend the motherland, right? And my Senegalese grandfather fought during World War One, my father during World War II, and even as France was being kind of at the imposition of German structures and etc. Even during the war and right after, France was launched wanted to keep its empire intact. And for example, in 1944, so that was still during the war, West African soldiers who had just been transferred from France to Senegal, where they were stationed, they were massacred by the French army. 300 people were killed, 300 soldiers still in their French uniforms, right? They were massacred because they had dared demand part of their pay that had been promised to them, that was due. They were rounded up, on a square and just mowed down. In 1945, the massacres of Sétif in Algeria. Again, Algerians too had been part of the war effort. And the numbers of the people killed varied. It's estimated between 6,000 and 30,000. That was in 1945. 1947, Madagascar, the French army there again massacred between 11,000 and some say as high as 100,000 people. The war in Indochina started in 1946 and lasted until 1954, and then there was the war in Algeria, and so on and so forth. So it's all of this was kind of forgotten, if you will. And then what happened also is that with the immigration of people from the former colonies in France, then things started to come up to the surface. And ironically, actually, in France today, when people see, the immigration of Muslims, Africans, and others, they say, that they feel colonized, and that for them is not good. It was good for the others to be colonized. It's not good for them to be, right? So so what happened also is that there are ways when this history can be presented in a more palatable way. And I'm thinking more precisely, to go back to our conversation about slavery. There's also an immigration of people from the French Caribbean, and French Guyana and Réunion and other islands of the Indian Ocean that were
colonized.
And so what happened, for example, in France in 1998 is that, you know, there was France celebrated in grand pomp the 150th anniversary of the abolition of slavery, which happened, you know, in the French colonies in 1848.
Yeah.
So we celebrate and we commemorate abolition, but we don't speak about what we abolished, what was done before the abolition, right? So, but that there was a wrinkle there because there was a march, a silent march of 40,000 descendants of those people who had been enslaved, and you know, to pay homage to their ancestors and to kind of break the silence, you know, about slavery.
Yeah.
And that was also in 1998. And in 2001, France was the first and the only country to recognize the slavery and the slave trade as crimes against humanity, and it was done thanks to Christian Taubira, who was then the representative of French Guyana to the National Assembly. And the one who introduced the legislation, and it was voted and it was accepted. The only other country which also has recognized slavery and slave trade as crimes against humanity is Senegal, that did it in 2010.
Right.
But all of that was good, but did it change things? Well, in some small parts, yes. But for example, 11 years after this recognition, there was a huge memorial built in Nantes, and Nantes was the preeminent slave port in France. And once again, this memorial is about what? It's the memorial of the abolition of slavery. Once again, we talk about abolition, we don't talk about anything else.
Right.
And this whole enterprise, this whole memorial is really, in my view, totally shameful. It's, you know, bad history, and it has really very little to do with reality. But people go there and they are happy, and you know, they think that, you know, they're since, you know, history and all that.
Yeah.
So I still see also, you know, a few things being done recently. I think it was like last month, Amsterdam published a book which is free about the role of the Netherlands in the deportation of Africans to the Americas, about 600,000 people. And also through the Indian Ocean, because the Netherlands deported about 1 million people through the Indian Ocean.
Wow.
So that's one little step.
Yeah.
Also last month, Germany apologized for its genocide in Namibia.
Yes. What about
and promised $1 billion over 30 years in development aid. But the people, the populations who had been victimized by this genocide are actually absolutely incensed because they have not been consulted. And what they wanted was reparations. But European powers, European countries don't want to open the door to reparations.
Discussion,
At all. Already, Burundi has demanded $43 billion from Germany and Belgium. The Democratic Republic of Congo is also demanding reparations. So there is, you know, there's no discussion about all that. So what there is today is something like, like regrets, maybe some kind of apologies, that kind of stuff. But let's not go further than that.
Let's not negotiate money. It's interesting that the story that you told about, France celebrating the abolition of slavery. I'm not talking about what came before it, because I guess it's easier to say that the abolition was something good that France did, and without having to talk about all the not so good things that happened leading up to the abolition.
Exactly.
Yeah. And all of these things that you're telling us, Dr. Diouf, are so important for people in the diaspora to come to terms with, to come to understand, because without understanding and knowing about these stories, then we don't have a full picture. The younger generation, obviously, will have to embrace and believe in our stories and history more than ever going forward. How can we modify the way history is perceived and understood by Black youth, and how it's delivered to them? How can that be changed so that they see it in a different light? Because many Black youth, many youth in general, but Black youth as well, when you tell them about history, they're like, oh, it's so boring. It's just names and dates. How do we change that?
Yeah, I mean, this is very, very key. First of all, I think that, for young people, and I think for most people, all of this, the slave trade, slavery, it's ancient history. It's at best, it's in the distant past. But all that is completely, it's completely untrue. I mentioned earlier, my book about the people who were on the Clotilda, which arrived in 1860.
Yeah.
Well, among them was a young girl, Abake, who became Matilda. She was 2. She was 2 years old on the slave. She passed away in 1940. So she lived through the Middle Passage, enslavement, freedom, Jim Crow, World War I, World War II, the Great Depression. I talked to her grandson and her granddaughter, and so there are people today whose grandparents had been on a slave ship.
Yeah.
If we go to Cuba, there would be, where slave ships arrived even later. It means that there were people who had been deported through the Transatlantic Slave Trade who were still living in the early 1960s. Wow. So that's when Generation X was coming up. There are people in the United States and in the other countries in the Americas who were born enslaved and lived until the 1980s. That's very close to us.
Yes, very.
And there are people in, including in the United States, whose fathers had been enslaved, and it's fathers because men can have children for much longer than women do. So we have, for example, this case that, there was an article recently, I think it was maybe a month ago, about this man who was 88 and whose father had been enslaved in Virginia. So actually, what it all means is that millennials are the first generation of people who have not lived at the same time as people who had been enslaved in the Atlantic world. Wow. So we really have to realize how close to us all this is. It's not ancient history at all. And we live with the consequences and the legacy every day. And young Black people, maybe even more than others. So they really are the ones who need to learn about this history. And I think that social history which is not about dates. It's not about a few great figures. It's really about the lives of the people. And with that, they can have a sense of who their ancestors were, because not everybody was a Frederick Douglass and a Harriet Tubman. Right. And actually, the focus on heroes and calling only a few people heroes obscures the reality, obscures all what the millions and millions of people did to fight back, in many different ways. And so with the history of the people, then you can have a sense of what the ancestor did on a day-to-day basis. And those are stories with real people, with real names. So I think it's important, for people to understand that part of history, and it makes it much more accessible, I think.
Yeah, of course. I really like how you talked about, this tendency that we have to select key figures and lift them up, and which is fine. But then there's so many others who probably did very similar things, which is we don't know about them, the hidden stories, the voiceless in this process, and they need to be honored as well and taken into account. To come to a close, Dr. Diouf, as someone who has worked with these stories and this information, this data all her life, what advice or comments would you give to those who want to contribute to reconciling this narrative, to raise awareness and to reveal these hidden and forgotten stories?
Well, I think that one of the things that is really close to me is there's really a need to visit or revisit the story of resistance to the slave trade in Africa, because that's one of the things that people have no idea about.
Yeah, I've never heard of it.
That's also why Africans still today are told, you sold us, and people have this idea that Africans were perpetrators of the slave trade and they were victims. But the victims for them are the people who were deported, and of course they were, but their loved ones as well were victims, right? So the story is much more complicated than people think. And the story of resistance to the slave trade in Africa is the least studied part of this entire story. I organized a conference in 2001, and I edited a book which was published in 2003. Yes, about that whole story with contributions by eminent scholars. And we studied all the different protective, defensive, and strategies for the people, against the slave trade, and also the offensive strategies how people attack the slave trade. So all of this is very important to know, because again, it's a major part of the of the story. I would also still, with this idea, also people want, like people to understand, again, it's the people's stories, stories that have not been told or not enough. But, if you, people in the Americas, I think, have kind of a distorted idea also about what Africans, thought and were doing. Because if you ask somebody today, well, if your child disappear, you would say, oh, too bad. Or would you spend the rest of your life looking
for them?
And people, in the Americas, descendants have no understanding of what happened in Africa at the time. But people who could, and it was difficult, but people who could, would go to the coast, trying to buy the freedom of their loved ones or inquire about where they were.
Yeah.
And for example, you know, and it was very difficult, but there were some who managed to do that. You know, there's this woman in Rio who was freed after 20 years because her brother had finally found out where she was, and he paid for her freedom. He was in Africa, right? There's another story that I found of an African father who went to Pike County, Georgia, to buy the freedom of his son. And by then, his son had already had 11 children. So it gives you an idea of the time, you know, the father was looking for his son.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, they both died before they could come back.
Incredible.
The people on the Clotilda, they said, we know our families hunted for us. And 50 years after they had arrived in Alabama, a woman who was interviewing them, to, you know, for a book, they told her, use our real names, which she did, because if by chance the story goes back to where we came from, people will know that we are still alive. So people, you know, were in the Americas through the slave trade, they knew that their loved ones would be looking for them and trying to, you know, to find them. They had the hope. They lived with this hope. They knew that it would be very difficult, and of course it was. But it's not like the people were in the Americas had this horrible view of Africans in general. First of all, Africans didn't exist at the time. Black people exist at the time.
Yes.
You know, so we have to understand those links also, so that, you know, Afro-descendants in the West don't see themselves and their ancestors as just being sold by Africans. You know, there's a whole story, a whole family, a whole people story behind that.
Well, I mean, you've just stunned me again, Dr. Diouf, because in thinking about enslavement and slavery and the history of all of it, you know, as a descendant of Africans in the Americas, it's so far from us to even start thinking about what happened to the families, or how did the families left behind, the communities left behind, the societies left behind, what did they endure as part of this process? And now that you've talked about it and you've raised it puts a whole different spin on things, a whole different perspective, in my mind at least, and I hope in the minds of all who are hearing this discussion and who will hear it going forward. I really want to thank you for taking the time out to have this discussion with us. I know talking about these things is not always easy, but you made it seem so accessible, which I guess is testament to the fact that you're an excellent social historian. On behalf of the Black Consciousness Festival, I want to say thank you, Dr. Diouf, for sharing your knowledge and your insight on these things with us.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Great. For those watching, coming up at 1 p.m. Atlantic Standard Time today, we have another conversation, reconstituting, restoring, and reconstructing what is reparatory justice and why. We'll be talking with Professor Eliza Barkan, who comes out of Columbia University, and Jessica Ann Mitchell Arroyo. That conversation is led by Omari Ashby. So stay tuned and join us at 1 p.m. Thanks again.
Thank you.